Chinese leader Xi Jinping will not allow Russia to make peace in the war against Ukraine, even if Putin wants it. China sees this conflict as a proxy war to wear down both Moscow and Washington before the invasion of Taiwan. This idea is written today by The Telegraph, and it emphasizes that Trump is now trying to use different tools, different levers of pressure on the Kremlin to finally end this war, including secondary tariffs against India and China for buying Russian energy resources. But the publication concludes that Xi Jinping will do everything possible to influence Putin so that Putin does not stop this war, because stopping the war is absolutely unprofitable for China. For China, it is much more beneficial for this conflict to continue indefinitely, wearing down both Washington and Moscow at the same time. Today we'll discuss the arguments being made in Poland and their benefits. I'm Alexei Pechi. It's August 7th. Let's review each step carefully. But before we start, I ask you to subscribe to this channel, give it a like, leave any comment you want, and be sure to subscribe to my Telegram channel, Pechi News. The link to it is in the description of this video. So, as The Telegraph writes, Donald Trump continues to increase pressure on Russia ahead of a new deadline set for Putin to agree to a ceasefire. By the end of this week, the United States imposed an additional 25% tariff on India as punishment for buying Russian oil. Trump responded directly to the grim warning from former Russian president, the main drunkard of the Russian Federation, Dmitry Medvedev, about nuclear war by moving 2 nuclear submarines to counter this threat. Trump's special representative Steve Witkoff visited Moscow again on Wednesday for Kremlin talks. Trump and Russia may meet as early as next week. In other words, Trump is testing various tools to establish peace in Ukraine. But will any of them actually work? Obviously, we'll find out soon enough. But now there are strong reasons to believe that Donald Trump's art of the deal with Russia could be disrupted, and disrupted with the help of China. Furthermore, The Telegraph writes that what the president and his advisors may not have considered in their strategy toward Russia is that China sees itself as the winner in the war in Ukraine and is therefore extremely interested in continuing military assistance to Moscow. While the United States and Europe are waging a proxy conflict with Russia, writes The Telegraph. By supplying military equipment and financing Ukraine to weaken the Russian armed forces and economy, China is waging its own proxy war against the United States by supporting Moscow while refraining from delivering fully assembled weapon systems to Russia. To avoid Washington's anger, Beijing supplies it with dual-use technologies which are still used in the creation of military equipment. These critical components include microelectronics, optics for tanks, satellites, satellite sensors, navigation equipment, and the like. And China sells them to Russia openly through state-owned enterprises or secretly through front companies, supposedly for civilian use. In reality, they enhance Russia's combat capabilities, allowing Moscow to wage a prolonged war of attrition in Ukraine. China's role as an intermediary in Russia's drone warfare campaign is particularly significant, as this tactic has become a hallmark of Russia's war against Ukraine. It is believed that Russia annually imports drones worth millions of dollars from China and also manufactures them jointly with Chinese companies on Russian territory. According to intelligence estimates, Russia has set up a secret drone manufacturing plant in China based on the Kupol plant, a subsidiary of the Russian state arms company Almaz-Antey. Their engineers in China developed and conducted flight tests of a new long-range combat drone model called Harpy 3 by helping to fuel the Russian war economy. China, along with India, has become the largest importer of Russian oil, accounting for 47% of Russia's crude oil exports in June 1925. A significant portion of Russian oil exports is transported by a shadow fleet of unmarked tankers in order to bypass the regime. Last week, Beijing rejected the threat from United States Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent to impose 100% tariffs if Beijing continues this practice, becoming even more united with Moscow against the United States. China intends to increase gas imports from Russia while simultaneously reducing purchases of liquefied natural gas from the United States. Why is China so interested in supporting Russia in the war against Ukraine? Beijing's logic can be illustrated by the following Chinese action. So while two tigers fiercely fight in the valley, the wise monkey sits atop the mountain looking down and waiting to see how it all ends. Beijing sees itself as the wise monkey, patiently waiting while Moscow and Washington exhaust their arsenals. And indeed, although China and Russia publicly position themselves as allies, having announced a partnership without limits in 2022, in reality, they are strategic rivals. To be continued. Such opportunistic relations are aimed at achieving a common goal. In other words, it limits the geopolitical dominance of the United States and the West overall. Throughout their turbulent history, China and Russia have experienced numerous border clashes and to this day maintain a territorial dispute in the Russian Far East. Russia, experiencing a demographic decline, views the long-term migration of Chinese citizens into its Far Eastern region as a serious threat. And Putin, for example, issues warnings. He warned back in 2000 that if Russia did not make real efforts to develop its Far East in the short term, then in a few decades, its Russian population would mostly be speaking Japanese, Chinese, and Korean. That was a quote from Putin from the early 2000s. Says, China is interested in the continuation of the war in Ukraine, aiming to reduce the American arsenal of weapons, which is already depleted to a dangerous level as a result of aid. China believes that reducing United States combat readiness is crucial to preventing United States intervention in the future. China's reflection on Taiwan, which some American military officials estimate as a possibility around 2027, for Beijing, implementing its grand plan of a unified China by 2049 means securing control over Taiwan, and it likely takes priority over maintaining business relations and avoiding a trade war with Washington. And we need to understand that so far Russia has largely ignored President Trump's various maneuvers. Meanwhile, Beijing is conducting joint Chinese-Russian naval exercises in the Sea of Japan. The signal from Moscow to Beijing and Washington is very clear. Peace in Ukraine contradicts the plans of both sides. And as is well known, China, that's when Trump announced that he was moving 2 submarines, nuclear submarines, closer to Russia. In China, they announced that they were launching a submarine. I don't know how to say it correctly, their own nuclear submarines as well, so that they would patrol the Asia-Pacific region. Well, that's a clear hint, a clear response, like we can also launch our own nuclear submarines in order to, if necessary, threaten the Americans. And all of Beijing's logic comes down to the fact that both Moscow and Washington are being exhausted by this war. And both outcomes are beneficial to China. That's why China will try in every possible way to prevent Putin from going for a truce, even if by some miracle he himself wants it. That's the idea that was expressed today. What do you think about this opinion? Write your thoughts in the comments under this episode, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. That's all for now. Take care. Goodbye, everyone.